morning, everyone. Or actually good afternoon at this point. Hope everyone's been enjoying the session so far today. Thanks for joining us. We are talking today about the use of 4% low-income housing tax credits and the successful use of those tax credits in deals. My name is Penny Indictor. I'm with a partner with Berman and Dichter. We're a law firm that is based in Philadelphia. We specialize in affordable housing transaction for both 4%, 9%. We work with developers, nonprofit and for-profit, lenders, syndicators, investors, all the parties that come together to make these transactions. And I will be your moderator today. And our topic, as I said, is 4% tax credits. And that's to be distinguished from the 9% tax credits that you've probably heard about in other sessions. So today we're going to talk about how do we utilize these 4% tax credits in our deals in order to preserve existing affordable housing that needs to be rehabilitated and also to build new affordable housing within the 4% tax credit program. So we're going to talk about planning to use those credits, lining up sources and uses to use those credits, and we're going to hear from developers and development partners, investors, syndicator perspective on how to successfully put these deals together and then implement them. So let me do a brief introduction of the panelists and then give a little summary about our agenda for today, and then I will hand it over and we'll get started. The first speaker will be Ian Rawhauser. He is the Assistant Director of Real Estate Development for LIHTC Mid-Atlantic. He's going to be talking about the 4%, 9% distinctions. He's even going to walk us through a side-by-side source and use analysis of what your sources might look like in a 4% deal, 9% deal. And then after that, Ian will hand it over to Chris Paul from Diamond and Associates. She's a development consultant. She's a principal there. And she is going to be talking about the analysis that a developer may engage in order to determine whether a 4% or 9% is right for your particular project. What questions to ask and the analysis that a developer would go through. Chris will then hand it over to Lindsay Soika, who is Senior Vice President at R4 Capital. R4 Capital is a tax credit syndicator, so Lindsay will enlighten us with the investor syndicator perspective on all these issues. So we're looking forward to that. She'll particularly be talking about the new rules that just went into effect at the end of last year, which is actually fixing the 4% credit at 4%. So that is kind of cutting edge new information. So she'll be talking about that and we'll all sort of weigh in on that. And then Lindsay will turn it over to Sue McFedrin, who is the Director of Development in the Philadelphia area for Mission First Housing, who are also a nonprofit developer in this area. And Sue will be talking about the challenges of implementing all the planning that has gone into deciding whether you should do a 4% deal, lining up your sources and uses. She'll talk about some of the issues that come up in implementation. So thinking about how much rehab can be done, relocation issues, if you're preserving existing housing that has tenants in place. She'll go through some of the compliance considerations with all the different funding sources. And then particular to our current times, she'll talk a little bit about some COVID implications and how that's making it a little bit different to implement these types of deals. So with that brief introduction and welcome to everyone, I will send it over to Ian. Take it over, Ian.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Penny, for the introduction. Yeah, we're excited to talk a little bit about the 4% credit today. And, you know, I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion after each of our presentations, as these are interesting times. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've prepared a couple slides to walk through the 4% credit and as it compares to the 9% credit. All right, so hopefully folks can see that. Before I get started, I just wanted to talk a little bit about LIHTC for those of you who don't know or aren't familiar with us. I won't go through each of the bullet points here, but 2021, we're actually celebrating our 50th year of being in the business of affordable housing. We're a complete shop. We do real estate development, property management. We also have a resident services department. We do in-house compliance for each of our HUD and tax credit properties. We serve over 4,000 residents currently in 54 communities across Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland. And it's our mission to build hope and opportunity for all residents so they are able to reach their full potential through the creation, preservation, and strengthening of affordable housing communities. All right, so not knowing the audience, I'm sure I'd see a lot of familiar faces if we were back in Harrisburg, but I just want to take a few minutes just to go through sort of the history of the tax credit program itself. As many of you know, Tax Reform Act of '86 established the LIHTC program to encourage private investment and participate in the creation of affordable rental housing. Of course, prior to this, you had the public housing model primarily as the tool to create this type of housing. Oversimplifying it, but per Section 42, basically, a qualified low-income housing project is eligible to receive low-income housing tax credits from the IRS. And as many of you know, these are dollar for dollar reductions in an entity's tax credit liability in exchange for, as we'll see based on the type of credit, a substantial portion of equity for each of these projects. So how LIHTC works for developers, and again, we'll get into more detail on these, but we have the 9% low-income housing tax credit, which very generally speaking can cover up to 70 to 90% of total development's costs, subject to market fluctuations, the value of those credits, et cetera, many things. And then we also have the 4% low-income housing tax credit, which is our focus today, how to use that successfully. The equity from the sale of these types of credits generally covers around 30 to 40% of a total development's project costs. And in particular, and I have a slide after this, these 4% credits can be used in conjunction with 9% credits if we have a preservation deal that involves the acquisition of an existing building. But also, these credits are used when you have a project that qualifies for tax-exempt bond financing. And I'll get into a little more detail of how that works and the differences between the two. And then essentially, developers secure equity for their project by selling these credits, in effect, to a limited partner investor who in most cases becomes a 99.99% partner in the ownership entity for each of these projects. So two types of credits. The so-called 4 and 9% credits, they're also referred to as the 30 and 70% present value credits sometimes. As I mentioned, 4% credits are used to acquire buildings in conjunction with 9% credits on a rehabilitation project, or also for acquisition and construction costs in, again, projects that are financed through tax-exempt bonds. In terms of timing, with bond deals, these are, we call them non-competitive credits. In other words, the credits you receive for a 4% deal that's financed with tax-exempt bonds do not come from a given state's federal allocation of credits. They come directly from the IRS and the Treasury. Every state has, every state housing finance agency, PHFA here in Pennsylvania, has their own schedule, which you're all familiar with respect to the 9% rounds. In most cases, may not be a totally rolling application for 4% deals that use tax-exempt bond financing, but for the most part, you can work on submitting these types of projects to the housing finance agencies, throughout the year. One thing we wanted to mention in particular is that, and we'll talk more about this, I think, when Lindsay says a few words, but the legislation that was passed prior to year end had a pretty monumental clause in it that the industry has been advocating for a very long time. And that is the 4% applicable rate is now fixed for developments that receive allocations of these credits after December 31st of 2020. Prior to that, the 4% credit rate actually did float, unlike the 9%, which was fixed at 9% under HERA and extender bills since then. So really big positive movement with respect to that, and it's exciting. So so what I've done here is put together a sort of side-by-side analysis of what a 4% new construction project might look like versus a 9%. So this was based on a project that LIHTC actually completed in 2017. It was a 72-unit new construction project and was financed and closed under the 4% program. So on the top, you have the source and use analysis for what this 4% deal looked like. And I won't go through each line item, but I'll give everyone a minute or two just to kind of take a look. And the bottom section of this is that same deal as a 9% transaction. Again, this was sort of rudimentary, sort of back of the napkin look, but a couple things I wanted to point out that are highlighted here. And this will segue, I think, well into Chris's section of the presentation. But one thing that's very important to remember is that if you're doing a 4% deal that's financed with tax-exempt bonds, you're going to have a much higher per unit permanent loan with these types of transactions. So you'll see with this transaction in particular, we had around a $4.3 million permanent loan that can be structured in various ways. I think in this case, it was a long-term tax-exempt bond loan that we utilized here. One important thing, as you probably see, with that much less equity associated with 4% transactions versus 9% transactions, you're going to have a gap. In this particular transaction in Delaware, we had almost $4 million in soft sources from the state. And also we were successful in getting allocations from 2 federal home loan banks in this case. And we still had a GP contribution that was necessary of about $2.6 million. To give you an idea. And in Delaware, the maximum developer fee is $1 million. We're allowed to defer 50% of that, up to 50%. So, and as you can see, we're right on the cusp there as well. So the bottom section, basically, I take the 4% rate, plug in the 9% rate, and you can see we're raising about $5.5 million more equity. But with respect to the permanent bond proceeds, those go away, obviously. The 4% transactions not being competitive, we're not going after every single point in the QAP that we can. So in the 4% transaction here, we were actually able to have almost 90% of the units serve households at 60% of AMI. Again, to help boost our NOI so we could support that debt. With a 9% competitive transaction, you can't do that, right? Because we have income targeting that generates points to help make the project competitive. So we have a more, I'll say, traditional NOI when it comes to, affordable housing tax credit deals. So we're not supporting any permanent financing there. But still, you see that basically the plug there, which is the GP contribution, drops by about nearly $1.4 million. So it does make a very big difference. On the cost side, some things highlighted in blue over there, you'll have higher legal costs, closing costs, and financing costs, pretty much in every case when you're looking at a 4% transaction versus a 9% transaction. The tax credit agency's fees, which increased when you look at a 4% versus a 9%. Again, that's due to a much larger allocation of tax credits that are coming from the state there on the 9% side of things. So looking forward to taking questions at the end. This is a lot to digest, but thank you for the few minutes to kind of walk through that. And here's contact information for myself and our Senior Vice President, Director of Real Estate, Claude Hicks, which we can certainly share after the session as well. But with that, I will kick it over to Chris. And thanks again.
Thanks very much, Ian. And I just want to confirm, it looked like that was a new construction. You may have said that at the beginning, but that was a new construction bond deal, which
was.
Yeah, not so easy to make work. Good job. But interesting also that it was a couple $100,000 more to do it as a 4%. I think that's, yeah, that's what we see. So I'm, talking about, Chris Paul with Diamond and Associates. We are housing development consultants, and we are based in Philadelphia and work across the state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth, and also in a few other states. And we love to make housing development deals work. So that's what we spend our time puzzling over and talking about even when we're supposed to be being social, we seem to get into tax credit details. But anyway, I'm talking about sort of factors in determining what's right for you in 4% versus 9%. So I think, in our office, we have, we've, I think, closed, 20 or more 4% deals over the last 15 years, say. But we have seen a few 4% new construction deals work. They're not that easy to make work. So generally speaking, what you need is massive soft funding in order to make them work, which Ian showed that they had. We also really feel like you probably need a rent subsidy in order to support debt, because I think the ability to support debt is a component. You can make we have done new construction 4% deals that aren't able to support debt, that just for whatever reason they didn't have enough NOI to support debt, but those deals did have massive amounts of soft funding. So, and in those instances, we use short-term bonds in order to, meet the 50% test. With the 9% credits, as Ian said, they raise a lot more equity, so they make, a costlier deal is much easier to make work using the 9% credit. And generally speaking, I would say we're rarely, if a client asks, can this be a 4%, we'll run a scenario, but mostly it's only when we see a preservation deal that we say, hey, let's, actually first see if you can make this a 4% deal, because you're going to end up, what we think is a better position, because you're not competing, because you're not, as Ian said, going for all the points. You pretty much, if you can make a pro forma that works, and you can do that yourself, you can do that with your consultant, you sort of figure out, is this feasible? And if it's feasible, then you're going to be able to make your deal work, and you're going to go to PHFA and you'll work through some processes, or go to another state agency and work through processes. But generally speaking, you have good certainty that this development is going to be under construction in a certain amount of time. And it's almost always a shorter amount of time than a 9% deal would take. I mean, we think generally you're going to be about 24 months or more from starting construction on a 9% deal. If you start talking about the deal today, with a 4% deal, you can shorten that time frame to 12 to 16 months. So that's a huge benefit. And you're not, the 9% program, by definition, many, and particularly PHFA has had one round a year for the last number of years. And so you really have one shot at the apple. If you don't win, you're waiting, going back in, trying to compete again. So there's really it can be well longer than 24 months from construction if you go the 9% route. So, but the downside to the 4% route is that your equity number is lower. You have to really come up with these additional sources. So when we have a preservation deal, we have, I sort of listed out questions that we'll ask the developer and of the deal to kind of try to help make a determination. So what are the capital needs of the property? Is the property, in pretty good shape and really just is looking for some cosmetic upgrades? Maybe only needs to replace heaters, but isn't otherwise in dire need of capital improvements. In that instance, then a 4% execution is going to work well, because your costs are going to be lower as a result of that. I mean, we're seeing, new construction tax credit deals come in at over 300,000 a unit. In a preservation deal, you may be really looking at 50,000 to, 50. Now I'm sort of switching between total development costs and hard costs, but 100,000 a unit maybe for a 4% deal all in. So it's just you've lower construction costs. What's the appraised value of the property? That is a key piece. The 4% uses most regularly the acquisition credit in addition to being used for construction costs. So the appraised value, if it's not very high, it isn't going to help you that much make this deal pencil out. But the higher the appraised value, the more that you can actually use the seller note mechanism to help meet your 50% test. So that's a trick that works well to make a 4% deal pencil, and that's so that you want to kind of have some understanding of where will your property appraise. It'll be the building value, not the land value, that comes into play, but it's still helpful to help raise acquisition credits. Now in the last 2 weeks, we're asking the question, does the 4% fixed rate help my deal? If you did a pro forma with a 4% execution in November, you might want to take it out again and see if it's looking any better as a result of the fixed rate. On the sort of negative side of questions, and I think Lindsay will be helping us answer this, but what's the investor market like? Is the smaller flow of credits that show up in my smaller 4% deal less likely to attract investors because it's almost too small, or has the 4% rate fixed, or is the market now flooded and pricing is going to be depressed as a result of the 4% fix, which is not the result that was intended for sure. If you have a large number of units in a preservation deal, there's no cap on the number of credits. So in Pennsylvania, in Pennsylvania, we have a cap on the 9% credits. And so if you have a large deal, we know in new construction, you can only make a certain number of units work because of the credit cap. And so if you have a large number of units, rather than breaking up the deal, and condoizing it in order to rehab it, how about doing it as a 4% deal so that you can really undertake one development and save on the sort of multiplication of transaction costs. For new construction, I wrote a few questions down for new construction or an adaptive use rehab where it's not housing. Can I support debt? If I can support debt in a deal, then sometimes it is worth really running that 4% because that is such a piece of the puzzle. But if you don't have a rent subsidy, you're probably unlikely to support much debt. If you can only support a couple $100,000, that does not help as much. What kind of soft sources are out there? Two of the new construction 4% deals that Diamond executed were before the HUD 202 program went away, and now it is back, but it was pretty small amount last year. So not sure of the latest on whether ANOFA has been released this year, but with the 202 capital advances, we were able to, get a good chunk of HUD money to make a 4% new construction deal work on a, 40 unit deal, which was pretty great because I think you take it out of the waiting and the competition. And then, the most important, can I achieve the 50% financing over 50% of financing by tax exempt sources? Because you are only entitled to the 4% credits as of right if you meet the 50% test. So if you do not meet the 50% test, you have to compete for those 4% credits. So that's a cliff test, and it's one that you have to have in mind as you begin to consider a 4% execution. So I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay now, who can maybe talk to us more about the where things stand in the equity market. Thanks, Lindsay.
Thank you. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, Ian, for giving us the background of the difference between the 4% and the 9%. Just want to introduce myself. My name is Lindsay Soika. I work in acquisitions in the equity group at R4 Capital. R4 Capital is a nationwide syndicator, lender, loan servicer, and asset manager. We were founded in 2011, and since then we manage more than $5 billion of affordable housing, equity, and debt investments. Our growing portfolio spans 46 states and territories and consists of more than 44,000 units of affordable housing. One of the highlights I wanted to bring up that everyone has been discussing is the highlight of the bipartisan bill, the permanent minimum 4% LIHTC rate. The purpose of this is truly to strengthen the feasibility of affordable housing development throughout the country. The provision is effective for acquisition LIHTCs, low-income housing tax credits allocated after December 31st, and for bond finance properties placed in service and receiving allocations from private activity bonds issued after December 31st. So what does that mean? So basically any deal that's closing with bonds or placed in service after December 31st for acquisition purposes will qualify. What's in question, however, is how retroactive that could be. So if a deal closed in 2020 or anytime earlier and has bond drawdowns, for example, which have subsequent allocations or drawdowns after the 31st, that we're unclear if that will qualify. At this point, a lot is based upon interpretation. So we'll need to have the IRS provide some further guidance on the retroactive. But for new deals, it will certainly add additional credits and equity. So to that point, based on Ian's example and what Chris was saying, the 4% deal, while it struggles for some deals to pencil out, especially new construction, is gaps. So this will hopefully help bridge any of those financing gaps. In recent months, the variable 4% applicable percentage rate has fallen to historic lows. So if you look at where it was in December versus the 4% fixed right now, you're talking about roughly 30% more equity and credits due to this fix. Now, as an investor, as syndicator, what you'll see in the market is that the impact of the higher equity without any offsetting losses will lower our pricing. But the pricing decrease will not, in terms of the net benefit will be much greater equity proceeds, regardless of a drop in pricing. That will far outweigh it. Another thing to keep in mind is we have not yet seen how this will impact soft financing from states. Right now, everyone has to, resubmit. So if you had a 4% transaction that you were thinking about in November, December, obviously you would resubmit that with the additional equity. And it's up to each state to determine what the gap financing would be. So if they had committed to a certain amount of soft financing, they may or may not agree to that as well going forward. So again, that's something we're going to have to wait and see. But the idea is, in general, to make these deals pencil out better. And from Ian's example alone, just additional equity will help and, help to bridge any of those gaps. The other thing to keep in mind, especially in, Pennsylvania, is that there isn't really a bond cap issue here. You see bond cap issues mostly in the coast and in Texas and Colorado, but in other states, this will generate a huge amount of additional units because there really isn't a bond cap issue. And to everyone else's, to both what Ian and Chris mentioned previously, this is a non-competitive credit. So you can easily get those credits. Another thing I think in general is just, can the market absorb the additional credits and equity? I think right now we intend to, we are, obviously. We'll have to see how everything plays out. Where will investors look? Will they look for higher yields? How will it impact pricing? Like I said before, just in general, looking at deals that we had originally priced out to where it looks like on the 4%, we are seeing a couple penny reduction. But as everyone knows, this is a very dynamic market. So we expect, things to change over time, but we also expect, even with the new legislation, that the corporate tax rate might increase, which will also impact pricing. So again, we're sort of balancing this out and waiting, but for right now, we are pursuing the additional credits. We are adjusting, our projections and our pricing, and we're excited to add additional units to the industry, and I'm sure everyone else is as well. So other things that we could get into, certainly more with questions and answers, but oftentimes people say, how do you adjust your investment to increase pricing with or without this reduction? So some simple things are depreciation assumptions, the immediate expensing of acquired personal property and site work, things to keep in mind when you are penciling, as well as delaying your equity. Sometimes that can be accomplished through bridge loans, or with the low interest rate market, just sort of weighing in on your construction loan a little bit more, because it'll oftentimes be cheaper than the equity that you're pushing forward aggressively. And then for any kind of soft loans or even seller finance acquisition loans, to increase those interest rates to help with the offsetting losses can also help drive your equity pricing. But I echo what everyone's saying in terms of 4% deals. I think we've seen, the industry as a whole has seen 4% deals clearly take over. I mean, I think at one point, maybe it was probably a quarter of the business, and now it's probably closer to 50%. And we'll obviously see more of that going forward. So I think at this point, I'm going to pass it along to Sue. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lindsay. Hello, everybody. It's nice to speak with you today. I'm going to go ahead and screen share. I did not do this during the trial period before we came on, so hopefully it will work okay. My co-panelists will, I'm sure, tell me if it doesn't. Okay, how does that look? Is that good? Oops, I'm not hearing anything.
Yeah, we don't see it yet. We're not seeing it.
Huh. Oh, yeah, right. Hold on. Sorry. One sec. And never mind. Okay, I'll skip it. Anyways, I'm going to talk about, so today I actually, I'm the Director of Development for the Philadelphia region at Mission First Housing Group. We are a Mid-Atlantic organization, much like our colleagues at LIHTC. And we serve a region that goes as far south as Washington, D.C. And then we have a few projects as far north as central New Jersey. We house about 5,000 people in approximately 3,800 units. And we have our largest nodes of development are in the DC metro area and in Philadelphia. We do a lot of preservation work. We had acquired early on in our history a number of properties that were not tax credit properties. And so we kind of got into the world of preservation when those properties began to need reinvestment. And the 4% credit seemed to be a better alternative than competing for the 9% credits. So as a development person, my passion is really sort of raising all the resources that are needed in order to make a project work, and getting that through the approval process, through the closing process, and to that starting point. And I had worked as a consultant for a number of years, and it was very eye-opening. And in my consulting practice, it was mostly just getting folks to that point. And once I joined the organization and kind of went through that full development process, I realized that it doesn't stop at the closing, it really starts at the closing. So there are a lot of implementation challenges that are unique to 4% deals that I think it's important for people to think about as they go into that. So one thing to think about is really, and folks have already touched on this, so I won't talk about it too much, but you're really not going to be able to do as much rehab as you would be able to do in a new construction deal. So you really have to make sure that for your deal, you can find a sweet spot between the capital needs that you have, the things that need to be addressed, and you typically go out and get a capital needs assessment in order to help you understand that, the scope of work that you want to do. And I think if a developer is accustomed to new construction projects, you're really, it's a very much an architect driven process. It's sort of managed by the owner, but the architect is really to some degree kind of driving the bus on design and offering options. I think the 4% process is much more owner driven because the building, your maintenance people know where the problems are. So you're going to work very closely in tandem with the architect to identify that scope of work. And then finally, how much money do you have, right? And in some, there's an overlap between those three things. And when those things can overlap and everything else in the project can kind of come together from a feasibility perspective, then you can do it as a 4% deal. We always try to find a way to do something as a 4% first if it's an existing project. I guess another thing to think about is, these are occupied buildings. They're not vacant buildings. So that means there are residents in place, and residents, you're basically going to be working in their home. So whether there's a couple different ways to do this. I'm going to talk about them from the way that's sort of the most financially beneficial to the way that's the least financially beneficial. The most financially beneficial thing you can do is not move residents out of their unit. So let's say you have a building where you need to do kitchens and bathrooms, or part of a kit. Let's say that somebody needs new countertop, new sink, new appliances. Basically, you need to find a way for a week or 2 weeks for that resident of that unit or whatever group of units you're working on to have somewhere else to go during the day. So some folks go to work, some folks go to school, some elderly folks. Now, I won't even talk about COVID because it changes everything, but maybe they go to a senior center. Maybe you set something up in the community room where they can go for the day. So the most advantageous way is to just keep people in their units throughout. We often use a strategy which is called hoteling, which is basically we take 4 or 5 units in the project, and we either renovate them or just do some minor renovations to sort of make sure that they're in good enough shape. We move residents out of those units into out of their unit into those hotel units, renovate the resident's unit, and then move the resident back. So it's an enormous amount of coordination on all that moving. If you think about, people need boxes, you need to hire the movers. Sometimes there's rent subsidy providers like the housing authority that needs to be looped in. People have pets, people have health issues. So there's an enormous sort of logistical effort that goes on behind the scenes that isn't often talked about, that's just important to think about early and to plan for carefully. And you can include this in your budget. It's not basis eligible, but it's a cost that you can and that you really need to include in your budget. And then sort of the least financially advantageous way to do it is to move people off site. Generally speaking, you only do that as a very last resort, maybe in a building that has relatively severe issues and you really just need to get the residents out for some reason. So something to think about how you're going to make that happen, working closely between development, construction, and property management. Quick, compliance is not exciting, so I won't spend too much time on it, but there are a lot of compliance complexities that come up in a 4% deal. You're going to have an old indenture restrictive covenant in Pennsylvania. They don't release that. They add the new one on. So the old restrictions stay until they burn off, and then the new ones kick in. You may be adding new financing sources that have different income restrictions like FAIR or home or CDBG or Federal Home Loan Bank. So you got to think about how those are going to overlay on an existing project that has different requirements, that already has requirements. And then there's a whole compliance exercise where within 120 days before or after closing, every tenant has to have an income cert. And so that's a huge lift for your compliance people. So these are just things to sort of think about in advance that don't normally come up for us developers. We don't normally have to think about that. And then, I won't talk too long about COVID because hopefully we are sort of, over the course of the next year or two, we will have to think about that less. But if you are planning a project in the short term, I suggest that you think about some of the things like, getting professionals on site. We would often do a unit by unit walkthrough with the contractor and the architect. Much more challenging these days. So we have done some of that, but we're working on a project right now and we were only able to get into 3 units because residents weren't comfortable. We didn't even try to access senior units. It's just not worth it right now. Occupied rehab is not going to be happening during COVID. You're going to really have to have those tenants out of there because otherwise you'll have a contractor and a tenant in the unit at the same time. So there's plenty of other COVID concerns to think about. The other thing I would say is that the due diligence process is everyone is very focused on making sure that you have a good plan to deal with COVID, both on the property management side and on the construction side. So just think about that in advance and be prepared for that. So that is all I think I had to say. So thank you. I think Penny may be headed to the question phase at this point.
Yes, so I thought at this point, just to make it a little more interactive, we would do sort of a roundtable discussion, get some different perspectives on some different issues. A couple questions have come in from attendees, so why don't we try to address those first, since that's what's on people's mind. Sue, since you were the most recent presenter, I'll direct the question that came in for you. And the question is, what is the typical cost of turning over the units between moves? If you have a sense of that, or if anyone else has.
Yeah, so I would say, and Ian, you may have thoughts about this as well. I would say that between the moves, it's really just a good cleaning. Every once in a while, you'll have a situation that comes up that a carpet gets ruined or something like that. But with respect to the hotel units, we just really make sure that there's a good cleaning that happens between tenants. And we would like to be able to do it more quickly, but if we're doing a phase of say 5 units at a time, we usually try to leave a week in between the end of one phase and the beginning of the next phase. It seems like, oh, you can do it all over the weekend or on a Monday. But like I said, they're families, they have, jobs and pets and school and everything. So we usually do like however long the cycle takes, maybe 4 weeks. Then we have a week in between for the cleaning and the moving, and then we start up the next batch. Ian, I'm not sure if you have anything to add there.
Oh, I think we sort of apply the same principles. We call it the leapfrog approach with respect to having some vacant units once we commence the work that we do first. And again, leaving COVID aside for a second, and then having that work done and then moving the first block, if you will, into those newly renovated units and then back in and so on and so forth as you move through the properties and the buildings. I think it's tough to put a number to it, right? Because every household's different and the needs of every household might be different. You might have someone who's, disabled, for instance, who can't even, may not be able to physically even put their belongings in boxes. It is important to note, though, that I think every state that we've worked in, they do have a regulatory cap, a per unit cap on the amount that we can put into our relocation budget. Oftentimes, we're going in for waivers for that anyway, but it's something that we do need to note. But yeah, it ranges anywhere from probably you can expect 800 to 1,500 a unit, I would say, depending on individual household situations.
Great. Thank you both for weighing in on that one. Ian, there was a question that came in going back to your presentation. Wondered if you had obtained or at least pursued project-based Section 8 vouchers to serve the very and extremely low-income families in the 4% development that you were referencing.
Yeah, so that one happened to be in a neighborhood of Western Wilmington in Delaware, downtown. And unfortunately, you know, we always want to have the conversation with the local housing authority there about getting new project-based vouchers. Unfortunately for that one, we were not. So again, we had a very rare case where the state came through with a lot of money on a per unit basis. We were thankful that we had a lot of foundation support, that we were able to get a pretty large GP capital contribution in the project. But in that particular deal, you know, all the stars aligned, but we were pretty much using just tax credit rents. And that's what was underwritten, so.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ian. Another question that came in that is kind of going back to some of those relocation costs that Sue and Ian were just talking about. The question is, is PHFA or HFAs in general, in your experience, allowing the cost of a relocation specialist, someone that helps with coordination of the move, residents in and out, into the budget? So I don't know what you're seeing on that.
Sue, do you want to go first? Or Chris, if you have experience with that, I know you've done a lot of rehab deals too.
And then I just looked at the PHFA guidelines, and it's not specified that it's not allowed. So I'm taking the position that it is allowed. So in the most recent materials, I did not see it specified. I know it's been a subject of conversation in Pennsylvania. I know Pennsylvania also was clear that relocation is out of basis, but they have not said that a consultant is not allowed in the project.
I do think though, and Chris, I think it was you and I that might have been talking about this at some point, that under the right circumstances, if you properly document it, they will allow staff, property management staff, time to be included in relocation.
I think yes to that for sure, but also I think the most recent guidelines don't seem to indicate that you can include a consultant as, you know, a URA sort of specialized in the Uniform Relocation Act.
Yeah, I'll just add, in Pennsylvania, our experience has been solely with multiple property, multi-municipality, scattered site deals, where we've taken existing affordable housing projects, lumped them into one new partnership, and carried out a 4% transaction. And in those cases, you know, very much like Sue described, you know, it's driven, these were properties that we had already managed. So that process and engaging the residents and that logistical process was handled in-house. The example I had up a little bit earlier in my presentation, that's a very unique project where we're basically taking an existing neighborhood of housing that's over 100 years old, and sort of block by block, we're moving the population out of that housing that's functionally obsolete for the most part, demolishing it, and then building new tax credit housing. So there, we actually did hire a group, I believe their name was Auto Temp. They're based in California, because there we, you know, obviously we certainly had strict URA guidelines that we had to adhere to. Households that were temporarily relocated could qualify to come back, households that couldn't. And that got really, really pricey. The benefits, for anyone who's experienced it, for permanent relocating someone who's due URA benefits, it gets very, very costly. And it was in the deal, in the project, in the capital budget, but you know, again, not basis eligible. So you do have to watch that.
So can I ask Ian a question? Actually, you mentioned that you've done these portfolio deals. Can you talk a little bit about why? Like, what are the advantages of batching up a number of buildings together in a 4% deal?
Yeah, so I think the biggest one, you know, financially speaking, what you're able to do is take projects that, for example, one that might have project-based subsidy, and pair it with smaller, you know, existing affordable housing projects that on their own, even as a 9% deal on their own, and I mean, you know, the 18, 20, 24 unit projects, really not much you can do with them after the 15-year compliance period has ended. So you're sort of able to like I said, find that balancing act when you're underwriting these to sort of pair stronger projects with weaker ones, operationally speaking, so that they all can get, the benefit of the extended affordability period. And, in our case, we're usually putting in $30,000 to $35,000 a unit with these kinds of transactions and hard rehab costs. So that's the main benefit as we see it. And then obviously, from a mission standpoint, you're trying to preserve as many of these units as you can. So you're able to take them all out in one shot. It's not easy. Every deal is different. We just closed a very unique one prior to the end of the year, but it's a good model if you can partner with the right folks, if you're doing it for the first time, and take advantage of the program.
We had a couple more questions come in, so thank you to the attendees for your interest in these good questions. Two of them seem a bit related, so I'm going to ask them together, but I think maybe all of you can weigh in. The one question is whether you're seeing investors requiring a minimum amount of rehab per unit on a 4% deal. And related to that, I think, is the question of, have you determined that there's an optimal number of units to develop for 4% deal given the transaction costs? So I view those as sort of related questions. Maybe Lindsay, or if you have some thoughts on what investors might look for as a minimum amount of rehab, if you have something that rule of thumb for that.
Sure. So rule of thumb, I would say, 20, 25 hard costs per unit. The idea is you don't want to obviously just put a new coat of paint on it and call it a rehab and get tax credits for this. So looking at, true rehabs of preservation properties. And I guess to follow it up in terms of number of units, I mean, as an investor, we truly don't care about the number of units. I would say, from an operation standpoint, especially on 4% deals, the concern is capped rents and growing expenses, how to make the deal work. And when you have small number of units, that just becomes harder. So if you don't have, a Section 8 or other project-based subsidy, that can become impossible, I would say, especially in some rural areas where your rents are truly capped. But there's no real rule of thumb on unit size. I mean, we certainly see very small number of units in cities that can work without a subsidy, and then obviously with a subsidy, any number of units can work.
What about you guys on the developer side? Do you have any rule of thumb about how much you're going to do per unit? Or have you run into investors requiring a certain minimum before they'll look at the deal, or have you kind of, from your experience, come to say what the optimal number of units might be given the cost of the transaction? Or is it very varying?
From my perspective, it's very, very varying. We closed our first one of these 7 or 8 years ago. That one happened to be 377 units across, I think it was 6 or 7 properties. The one we closed this year was 5 properties, total of 208 units. The number I mentioned earlier is, what we're finding anyway is kind of a sweet spot with respect to the amount of rehab we're able to do. It's in that $30,000 to $35,000 a unit range. Again, a lot of variables go into that, but the things we're focusing on first and foremost, energy efficiency, I think, is number one. We're doing roofs, we're doing windows, we're doing HVACs where we can, pretty much whole house. Solar in a lot of cases as well to help offset some common area electric. The interior is very selective. Not every apartment is going to get brand new cabinets or new appliances or new, carpet. So that is where, as I think Sue mentioned earlier, deal, you're looking at every 100% of these units and really going in and sort of creating a matrix. Yes, they need a carpet really badly, or no, they don't, so on and so forth.
One other thing, we actually have been getting a few more questions, which is great. We're running a little short, so I'm just going to ask a few more and we'll have brief answers for as long as we can. So someone has asked about a pricing difference. I guess this would be with respect to a 4% deal rather than a 9% deal. I think what this is referring to is investor pricing. So what are you seeing, if you're seeing difference between the 4% and the 9%, what are you seeing in general in the market now for the 4%?
So I'll take that one. As I said before, with the 4% fix, we're certainly seeing a couple penny drop from what we previously had. But in general, I would say that the 9% and 4% are pricing pretty much in line. For the most part, one of the impacts in terms of our fund dynamics was leverage. So, oftentimes investors are looking at a price per credit as well as leverage in terms of total debt over your total development costs. So sometimes those 4% deals, which obviously had higher leverage, needed to either have a higher yield or a lower price to make it more attractive. With the 4% fix, we're actually seeing an increase in equity, which actually helps lower the leverage on that. And just in general, I think right now those 4% and 9% are pricing pretty equal.
Okay, great. Thank you. So another question someone had was, what have you noticed on the developer side that PHFA may be doing or have done to encourage the transfer of ownership and consolidation of the small, older deals with lesser capacity legacy ownership into larger portfolios? So what Ian was describing, has PHFA done anything or is anything in the discussion stage to encourage that kind of consolidation that Ian was talking about? Anything that anybody?
Is that for multiple owners? So different owners coming together into one portfolio? I don't know that I've heard of that happening yet. I do know the portfolio model was, I think HTC, did it first. I remember going to a session that they gave at the Housing Alliance conference, I think years ago, about the big portfolio project. And I know Mission First has done it too, but I don't know that I've seen any or heard of anybody doing, kind of 3 different owners coming together in one portfolio. Has anybody else?
I guess I would say one thing, this doesn't quite speak to that point, but one thing that I think PHFA has done, which has been willing to put fair money into preservation deals. So, we had one deal that we closed in December. That was a small deal, 32 units. For a variety of reasons, it was done as a standalone, which is not typical. Usually a small deal like that would be batched up with other deals, but without fair, we had some local subsidy as well, but without fair, it would have been extremely challenging. So those smaller deals often, especially if they don't have any rent subsidy attached to them, kind of need that. But I don't know, Ian, if you have thoughts about the portfolio. I'm not sure anything specific that's been done related to portfolio deals.
Yeah, I don't, from a sort of a regulatory and policy standpoint, I don't think there's anything there that sort of, distinguishes or makes it a little bit easier to do a portfolio deal versus not. I'll say our experience with each of these, again, has been positive with PHFA. We've had several different development officers. My one critique, if you could call it that, is, I think sometimes they create more work for themselves and others with respect to, these deals being sort of beholden to their traditional sort of 9% underwriting and due diligence process, which sometimes, we revisit certain concepts with the agency, but again, I think, they've always been amenable to seeing these portfolio projects come in and get them underwritten, because again, the idea is, we're preserving more units. So.
Okay, great. I know we are almost out of time, but the last question I had, I don't know if we want to go a minute over to talk about it at all, but people are someone has asked about if you're seeing more cost segregation studies being done to maximize credits, and how often are you working hand in hand with your accountants throughout the budgeting and application process to make sure you're maximizing the credits. So if anybody has a last thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. So overall, we are definitely seeing and encouraging cost segregation studies across the board. I would say that in some cases, we will encourage it even, especially for rehab, to do it in the pro forma stage so that you can get an idea from your accountant, even on paper, what that looks like. And then obviously throughout the process, but they are certainly helping in terms of modeling the depreciation up front, which could help your pricing as well. I don't know if you want to take it from the developer standpoint, Ian or Sue.
No, go ahead.
I can jump in and just say, I think we're seeing it suggested, but not a ton of people taking up the notion of doing it, you know, at the pro forma stage. But I have heard definitely from accountants that this is a good idea. It's just, I think sometimes there's so many other things you're figuring out that they're not paying, you know, that we're not necessarily seeing people pay attention and do the cost seg study.
Well, on that note, I wanted to thank all the panelists for great presentations, very informative. And I wanted to thank all the attendees because those were great questions and you've helped to avoid my worst nightmare of being on a session where no one asks anything and we all look at each other with nothing to say. So this I will take with me and hopefully be less worried about that in the future. So thanks so much, everybody. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you
Good
so
rest of your
much.
conference.